Hello, everyone, and welcome to my actual home office. I am coming to you today for week number 2, and we're going to be discussing a few things today. First, we're going to talk about the book. Second, we're going to talk about sort of the first chapter that I have you guys looking at this week, and then we will talk about where we're going to go from here, as well as giving you your first discussion board assignment. So I hope that all makes sense. First of all, let's talk about your book. Apparently, there was some mix up between what the online course said and what the bookstore bought versus what I gauged this entire semester on. So the book that was supposed to come in apparently was this different book. I do have a copy of it somewhere, but the book I want you to have, as I said in my announcements last week, is the book by Stuart Smith and Denton that's called Persuasion in Social Movements. And if you need more information than that, feel free to text me or to email me, and I'll send you a link right to the book on Amazon. That is the book I'm going to be operating from. You can buy it digitally, you can rent it. You can rent it digitally or materially. You could buy it material. It's completely and utterly up to you. Like I said, it's not nearly as expensive as some books I've used in the past, and we'll have supplemental readings too because this is a pretty quick read, but I think it's super clear and helpful in understanding how social movements work. That's why I picked the book, honestly. I think I played around with a couple other books, and that's what you're sort of seeing is that the bookstore rolled over what I did last spring. And so I apologize for that confusion. If you need any help at all, please do not hesitate to let me know. All right, so the first thing we need to really understand when we're studying social movements and persuasion is what is it we're trying to understand. Persuasion theory is pretty easy for you all at this point. I imagine it is, at least because maybe you've taken the persuasion course already, or you've taken 209, and 209 talks about all the different communication theories, including persuasion theory. So hopefully at some point you've sort of gotten into persuasion theory in the past. And of course, a theory is anything that guesses at what we think might be happening that we set out to prove. And some people think that a theory isn't a theory until it's been proven. But the whole point of a theory is to have something to work from before you prove it to be true. All the same, some persuasion theories have in fact been already established as effective, right? They're effective ways of studying what a social movement or what a communication phenomenon of any kind can do. So I'm going to quickly, and I mean quickly, run through some of those persuasion theories that you've probably heard about, and some that actually kind of work for social movements, although they may not work for other things. And we've got a lot of theory in communication because we study a lot of stuff, but we've got a lot of theory in communication that won't apply to social movements. So what is it exactly that we're looking for? When we're looking for persuasion, a lot of times we're looking for effectiveness. But how is it that we gauge or establish that effectiveness? Is it by the number of people that are recruited, by a poll that we do, a survey that we do? Is it by understanding how the message is constructed and guessing that it's actually persuasive or not? We're not really sure. But what I do know is that, and I just talked about this in my rhetoric class the other day, so if you're in my rhetoric class, apologies, you're getting this twice. There are generally 4 paradigms for studying communication. Actually 4 paradigms that exist within the entire scientific world. And these are the 4 I picked to talk about because I think they're the best to understand, particularly social movements. The first is known as the positivistic. The positivistic or post-positive perception or paradigm is basically the scientific method. It believes that there's one truth out there and that we can find that truth. Now, as communication scholars, you probably know that communication phenomena can be interpreted myriad ways. So it's not really easy to say that there's one single truth out there that we can know. However, if you did want to do this type of study and you were looking at effects, then chances are good that you would do some sort of survey, some sort of quantitative analysis of that survey that tells you on some sort of scale whether a message is effective or not. What we're coming down to, though, is the message effective? And the fact of the matter is that some people believe that you can study that from a scientific perspective. Like, for example, we could put electrodes on your head, or we can take your pulse and see what is more exciting, or we could put you on these little, this dial system. We even have it at the university, a perception analyzer, where you can tell us how you're feeling whenever you hear a certain message or whatnot. We could do all that. But for the most part, I find that to not be the most effective way to study persuasion or social movements. It doesn't really tell us much about whether or not the social movement is working. And really what we're interested in is what messages work. So in persuasion theory, are there certain theories that we use in communication that fall under the scientific method? Yes, I've just explained a few, but the fact of the matter is that most of the time it doesn't really work. So the next paradigm is the idea of interpretivism, or the humanistic perspective, which assumes that there's not one main truth that we can access through our 5 or 12 or whatever, how many senses we have. This is not empirical like the scientific method is. Instead, this is based off of interpreting what other humans say. So essentially, we're looking to find the truth or the answer from consensus. You may find interviews work really well for this, or you may find that focus groups work really well for this. And normally what we're doing is we're looking for themes. So we might be doing a thematic analysis. We might be working with different types of qualitative data. We won't really be looking at numbers because we're not looking for effectiveness so much as we're looking at what we believe the movement is trying to do and whether or not it's effective from there. I don't know if that's clear or not. Hopefully it is. The third paradigm, which is known as the rhetorical or the critical paradigm, is where we get into studying persuasion from the neo-Aristotelian perspective and from the argument perspective. What we're looking for is someone to rhetorically think about what persuasion methods are being used, what messages are being used, and evaluating them based on, for the most part, rhetorical methods, such as Aristotle's view of persuasion and the 3 artificial proofs, the inartificial proofs, or perhaps the Toulmin model of argumentation, and some of these other ways of examining the content of a communication phenomenon. The last paradigm that we're going to talk about is the postmodern paradigm. Now, in the postmodern paradigm, it essentially says in its extreme that there's no truth. There's no way for us to share meaning. Well, that's not really useful as far as paradigms go. But what is useful is that when you're not using it in the extreme and you're thinking about this for a second, we all experience the same phenomenon in different ways. So if we can communicate that in any way, shape, or form, this is a very individualistic way of looking at the world, of saying, hey, this works for me, therefore it should work for everybody, sort of thing. I always tell my students that the rhetorical perspective, critical perspective, and sometimes the postmodern perspective are really looking at things from that individualistic point of view and saying this should be true for everyone. And the only example I can think of that in the real world is influencers on social media, right? You've got one person who goes out and tries something new, whether it's Kylie Jenner's lip plumber. Is she the one who does the lip plumber? I think so. Whether it's a new skincare product, whether it's music, a movie, doesn't matter. My niece wants to be a travel influencer, so she goes somewhere and she wants to talk about why you should or should not go there. Interesting. Luckily, she has a day job. But the idea that one person can go onto usually TikTok, right? And Instagram, and suddenly suddenly influence a mass audience by simply giving their opinion of something, right? Which, by the way, is really radical to me, and I think I'm a little jealous because I could have made millions with my incredible interpretations of things. I wish I would have known that sooner, right? So I think we all would have wished we had known that sooner. But instead, what we have are people who have millions and millions of followers, and those people become influencers, and people buy advertising on them, and then they're rich. So we see in our everyday life how different persuasion techniques work and why they work or why they don't work. Now, when we get into specific persuasion theories, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post for you a sort of summary list of persuasion theories, possibly attach an article to that. I'm not really sure. And I'm going to have you just refresh yourself on what persuasive theories there are. Everything from the silver bullet to crisis management to narrative to argument, all of them. We're going to just refresh this there. I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on persuasion theory specifically because you've already had that. But what I do want to do is remind us of what it is exactly that we're talking about. I forget as often as anybody else, I guarantee it. The second question then is, if we know what persuasion is and what we're looking for, is what is a social movement? Now, there are many ways to answer that question. What I'm going to do is use Stuart Smith and Denton as the sort of guide for this, and the entirety of the first chapter talks about the things. I believe that there are 6 concepts or 6 ideas that answer the question, what is a social movement? Is this a social movement that I want to look at? In order to do that, we have to evaluate these 6 things. And if they don't meet any of this criteria, does that mean that they're not a social movement? Good question. I've had people argue all the time about whether or not, if you're missing one of these, does that mean you're no longer a social movement? Well, I don't think so. I'm not willing to make that judgment so quickly, but this is one of the questions we're going to explore. How do we define a social movement? So the first part of it is an organized collectivity. Now, what exactly Stuart Smith and Denton mean by a collectivity is not nearly as important as just saying that there is organization to it. And when we say organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be a hierarchy or a particular kind of leadership. It could be any of them. So in the book, it talks about the distinction between a campaign and a movement, right? And most of the time that has to do with the scope of what is needing to be done, and whether or not a particular movement fits into another movement and then thereby becomes a campaign. I will let you read those distinctions. But what's important is that we know that a social movement has to be organized in some way. So there may be a hierarchy. There may not be a hierarchy. There may be a media plan. There may be a way that we communicate. It could be that it's all localized into one area. One way or another, we have to be able to communicate with each other, and therefore it has to be organized in some way. That doesn't mean a strict organizational structure necessarily, but it has to be organized in some way. All right. So that's the first part of chapter 1. The second part is that it has to be uninstitutionalized. And this is of great debate. What does uninstitutionalized mean? It used to be back in 1997, before you were born, but when I was in grad school, we would talk about what is uninstitutionalized. And back then we defined it as simply not being a part of the government. Okay, that if you became part of the American governmental system, then you were actually no longer uninstitutionalized. And does that mean that you're not a movement anymore? Let me give you an example. The EPA was born out of 2 bills, the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which came out in the early 70s, if I remember correctly. Now, before I was born, believe it or not. Now, how is it that those became the EPA? Well, there was a movement towards clean air and clean water, and they got these bills adopted that said we should, in the United States Congress, that says we should be checking air quality and water quality. And then they decided, hey, there better be someone to oversee that air quality and that water quality. And thus was born the Environmental Protection Agency. And The EPA is very much so a part of our institutionalized government. Thereby, some people would say that the environmental movement is institutionalized. I don't buy that. I've got a lot of problems with defining institutionalized that way. I think a better way to think about it is that you don't have a social movement unless you have a reason to have a social movement. Like, for example, if you're fighting for clean water and clean air, most people would say, well, just go to the EPA. That's where that happens. Well, if you're in Flint, Michigan, by the way, if you've been in Flint, Michigan for the past 50 years, you are still fighting for clean water. How is that possible? Who knows? But it's still a movement because they still don't have clean water. In Pennsylvania, where they were doing fracking like 20 years ago, which, yes, that was a thing out in the middle of Pennsylvania, people used to be able to set their water faucets on fire. Literally, you turn the water on, strike a lighter or a match, and you would have fire coming out of your kitchen faucet because that's how toxic the water was. So just because the EPA exists, just because there's a Clean Water Act, does not mean that there's not movement to be made. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Large in scope. Okay, so a movement has to be bigger than just one or two people doing something, right? Now, large in scope can mean a lot of things. For example, it could mean that it's international or national or statewide, or it can even be localized in some way. I had a friend many years ago who was living on a street in Ohio, and on that street there were these new houses that had just been built, and the city wanted to come through and build basically a highway bypass right through the neighborhood, like literally just for a couple blocks. And it would destroy these people's homes, and it would destroy their yards, and it would make it more dangerous for their children to run around. And so there was an organized movement, and I can't remember the name of the street, but let's just say the name of the street was, I don't know, Oxford Street, okay? So it was the Oxford Street Coalition that got together all these neighbors and fought the city putting that highway bypass in. And by the way, they won. There were only 36 people affected by this, but the movement took on all 36. So the entirety of those affected by this change that they wanted to make. Does that make sense? So we're literally talking about everybody encompassed in this one issue. That is large in scope, okay? Whereas if we're talking about something, let's say a movement on the national level, you're not going to get the entire nation involved, every single individual, but you can get a large group of people within the United States or even within the state of Missouri to do something like work on Medicaid expansion or on getting abortion and women's health care language on the ballot like they're working on now. These things are large in scope based on how you define large in scope. It's not actually something that needs to be, affecting thousands or tens of thousands of people, but it should be affecting a certain portion, if not all, of the population that you're trying to help. I hope that makes sense to you. Other things that make it large in scope is how long this movement has to go on in order to achieve its goals, and also how big of an argument you need to make. In other words, how many people, how many events will it take? How many speeches will it take to get this thing changed? So it could be large in scope by audience, by community size, by the time it's going to take, by the number of events that you hold. Large in scope is very free there. The next is that it promotes or opposes changes in societal norms and values. Okay, so this one, again, questionable. What does that mean, that it changes in societal norms and values? Is it normal to be, dark-haired? If that's okay. Back in my day, it was not normal to be gray-haired at the age of 35, like I was, or at the age of 16, like when I started going gray. That was not considered normal. Now, did I need a movement to save me from that? No. But have we redefined normal differently now? Yes, we have. Apparently, gray hair is incredibly desirable now. And as someone who is 100% completely silver white, let me just say, I'm over it. But gray was not a cool color when I was younger, and now it's the in thing to do. So people with gray hair might have been defined as outside of the norm, but now all of a sudden it's cool. Or actually, it's been cool for a little while. I'm sure it's going out of style very, very soon. So that is a very sort of simplistic and lighthearted way to think about this. If we're talking about deeper things, I was actually just talking to a group of community members today up in North Springfield, and we were talking about the fact that when we Gen Xers were younger, if you were not a homophobic individual, you were considered to be gay. Like if you weren't actively homophobic, you were probably gay. That was exactly the way that we divided up that idea of community. It was incredibly divisive. Now, that came down from our parents. Please don't blame us. That was from the baby boomer generation. But as time wore on and we got into the 90s, we started going, hey, wait a minute, our friends are queer in some way, and I'm not homophobic. I love all my friends. I don't care who they're sleeping with. This is not important to me. Gen Xers tend to not care who you're sleeping with. Gen Xers don't tend to care what you're wearing or how you look or anything else. We're really kind of accepting individuals, even though we don't seem like it. But the one thing we are is apathetic. So we won't really fight to change these things. Luckily for us, as we grew older and into the early 2000s, we really started to change this. People started really pushing for an understanding of queer lifestyles as they were. I would consider most of these lifestyles now normalized in some way, not completely, certainly not completely, and not as much as they should be, but they are more normalized, I guess is the way to say it. So when I hear people out there fighting against the queers, against the homos, whatever word of derogatory invention they want to create, my response is they're human. We do not talk about other people this way. We do not separate people out based on these characteristics. In society, we're having that debate. It's a huge debate. It is impacting everything from book bans and challenges in high schools and schools, school districts across the country. Nixa, where I live, managed to make national headlines with their book banning, right? All the way up to, whether or not people who identify differently in gender or lifestyle or partner or whatever, whether they should even be allowed on college campuses. I mean, there's a real clash here that still exists. It's a different clash than when I was younger, but it's still the same clash. And so this movement towards acceptance has not just been large in scope in terms of the different ways that we categorize people and bringing that together, but also the long time that it's been going on. So it's extremely large in scope, and we're still battling the same values or normal, the idea of normal that we've been fighting for 50, 60 years, okay? Even before that, but we didn't really talk about it. So you have to oppose some sort of societal norms and values, or like sort of support changes to those or changes against them, I guess I could say. There are some movements right now out there that are trying to put religion into public school education. This is a big deal for me. I'm a big fan of keeping that separate. And as someone who went to private Catholic college and high school and grade school, believe me, I think I know what I'm talking about when I say church does not belong in our public educational system. If my parents wanted to choose to spend all that money and send me to some Catholic school, that was their decision. I had to live with it, but it's not something that belongs in our public school system as far as I'm concerned. And yet there is a huge movement to bring religion, literally churches, into our public school system. This is a real problem for me. I oppose that 100%. And it wasn't a debate when I was a kid, but all of a sudden it's coming back up. It's making a resurgence. So this is sort of a crisis point for anybody who wants to keep public education free and open and free of religion or of any idea of a higher order or a higher being at all, no matter what you believe. Like I said, I'm a Catholic, but that doesn't belong there. Maybe I was tortured in my Catholic schools. I'm not really sure, but it's something I'm fighting for, is to keep our public education public. In other words, not allow school choice, and keep our public education free and open to, intellectually speaking, to anyone. For me, every book, every class is an educational opportunity. And anytime we sort of dampen those down or remove a book or restrict a book or restrict teachers in the classroom, what we're really doing is taking away educational opportunities. Now, I'm on my soapbox right now about that particular issue, but you could see how that clash can occur, how it can be solved, and then it comes right back up again and makes a resurgence. We're going to talk more about those specifically when we get later into the semester. So it's an organized collectivity that's uninstitutionalized. Yes, I am reading off my phone right now. That is large in scope and that promotes or opposes changes in societal norms or values, okay? The next qualification is that it encounters opposition in a moral struggle. So what people might define as a moral struggle. Clean air and clean water is about humanity and being able to live a healthy life. Access to health care is about, it's a moral debate, believe it or not, about whether or not we should help and aid everyone who gets sick, no matter what their socioeconomic class, gender, etc. We can see that this isn't just about a church. It's not just about a particular religion over another. It's not about any of those things specifically. When we say moral debate, what we mean is that we're looking at the quality or value that a social movement promotes or challenges. Now, personally, I'm of the belief that it's all about equality. And equality is a moral issue. Should we all be equal in one way or another? And how do we define that? What is the difference between equality and equity? That's an important distinction that we're making these days. What the moral debate does not have to be necessarily like the 10 Commandments or the rules of Buddha or any of those other things. It can literally just be a question of the quality of life or an impact on a value of humanity, etc. Hopefully that makes sense to you. The next one is that encounter, or I just said that. The last one is that the persuasion of the movement is pervasive, meaning that it goes either through the entire intended audience or through a large portion of a country or a region, or that the messaging is going out for people that are going to be able to see it. And that persuasion is constant, or at least at the very least, it is pervasive in its scope and in its strength. That people feel that this is an important issue. If you have a social movement based on things that people don't really care about all that much, you're not going to have a movement for very long, right? It will fail. And so persuasion in this case needs to be pervasive, all right? So I'm hoping that that actually helps you out a little bit in understanding that chapter. I really just wanted to highlight the most important parts of the chapter to be able to give us a starting point for how we define social movements before we attempt to start studying them. I'm going to use an example of a social movement that I've been on the ground floor of for 2 years now. It's something like that. So my son graduated from Nixa High School. My stepdaughter, she goes to school in Arkansas. So I'm one of those people who's like, yeah, my tax dollars go to the schools. We want the schools to be really good. Nixa is very proud of their education system. But as a college professor, I have a vested interest in what our students are doing and what they're learning. But more importantly, as a community member, I want our students to be successful, and I want to know that they're getting the education that they deserve. So I've always been a little bit interested in what's going on at Nixa High School, and Nixa School District, but I haven't been all that interested until about 2 years ago when some friends of mine came to me and they said, listen, we have got to stop these people from taking books off the shelves in our library. That's how this all started. We found an issue. It is a moral issue. It was affecting the entire school district because the school board and others were making this a part of the debates in the public forums. People screaming that books were, apparently books were homosexual. I'm not really sure why a book is homosexual. That makes zero sense. I am pretty sure the book isn't having sex with anybody, let alone anything, let alone knowing which gender it is. It's kind of ridiculous, these arguments that people were making. And I said, you know what? This is ridiculous. And the 8 people that I was dealing with said, what do we do? And I said, we start a movement. And they're like, what? And I said, so I invited them all over to my house. We all brought some snacks. We met each other for the first time because this was all online communication until that point. And we started talking about what we wanted to fight for. And it happened that we had a librarian from the school district on this team and some very, very concerned parents about what books were being challenged and removed from the library shelves. Well, I didn't have a kid in the schools. Like I said, my son had graduated. My stepdaughter goes to school in Arkansas. So I was like, well, what do you guys want to do? What kind of fight do you want to have? And they were like, well, we don't want to say anything because we're afraid our kids will somehow get bullied or talked about at school. They don't want me to make a lot of noise or a racket. We're worried about what the school board will do, whether or not our students will get opportunities or not. And I was like, well, I don't have a kid in the schools, so guess I'll put my name on this thing. And so I sort of became the de facto leader at that point of a movement that I then created the logo and name for, by the way, which I'm very proud of. And we started this movement called U-Turn in Education. And it was specifically named that because we were fighting against another movement nationally called No Left Turn in Education. And I was like, I'm thinking I'm thinking U-Turn in Education. We need to, swerve this back. On a really bad U-turn, by the way. But we need to swerve this back and stop removing books from the school. And I thought, okay, I can do this. I can handle this. A book ban debate? Piece of cake. So I create this website. We create some social media about it. We start going to every single school board meeting to fight against this. And we end up in a quagmire of a debate. And by the spring of last year, so about 9-10 months ago, we get contacted by the New Yorker, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a national news magazine. And one of their writers wanted to come and write a story about this whole school board debate and book banning and everything else. I thought, okay, that's kind of crazy, but sure. Being from the Northeast myself, this was probably one of the biggest compliments I could have ever gotten. And of course, a lot of people around here, I had to explain to them what the New Yorker was. That's not really common reading material around here, but up north in the Northeast, it is. It's pretty common reading material. So it's a large scope audience. And so this author came down, and I didn't think she was going to come to Nixa, but she did. She insisted on flying to Nixa, and I told her to fly to Springfield, of course. And apparently she didn't believe me that there was an airport in Springfield, so she flew to Kansas City and then was like, why is it 3 hours from here to you? And I said, because I told you to fly into Springfield. It was a very interesting experience for her and for all of us. And she interviewed all of us. And at the time, because I just couldn't stay out of it, apparently, I was asked to run for school board to go against these people who were fighting to take books out of the libraries and do other things like stop CRT, whatever the heck that means. I don't know how you stop a theory, but we had some fascinating discussions about that. And there were these pastors and religious affiliated people trying to get on the school boards. We were fighting against a group called Moms for Liberty, which you may or may not have heard of, that is pervasive across the country, especially in Florida. And And we were, I was just gobsmacked by all of this. And so we got a ton of attention. And it was good attention. I am not complaining at all. The educational writer for the Springfield News Leader came down. We got, into the Kansas City Star, St. Louis, everywhere. We were in the news, and Nixa was making a name for itself in not the best way. But I have no problem exposing hypocrisy or what I consider to be a stupid decision. Now, we can have a moral debate about whether or not it's stupid to pull books off of shelves, right? Like, that's a moral discussion to have. So I knew that I had everything lined up for this movement. I knew we qualified as a movement, and I knew we could grow bigger because I started getting calls from Willard and Republic and Clever and Cassville and Ozark, asking us to have branches there or to advise them about how to start this kind of movement in their towns, because they were anticipating that there would be some book challenges coming. And they were not wrong, by the way. In fact, I'm going to Cassville tomorrow night to talk to them and train them in how to fight back, if we want to look at it that way. So the 8 of us that are on the board started to realize that we needed funding for things. And somebody keeps texting me. I apologize for the buzzing noise. The 8 of us on the board, who were like the original 8 that met in my my living room, we sort of said, okay, we clearly are going to need money to go to Pride. We need a booth at Creeping at the Crossroads, a float, whatever it is that we wanted to do. We had all these ideas, and it was going to cost a lot of money. Up until this point, we had been funding this thing ourselves. Like, I paid for the website. Somebody else paid for some printed materials. Somebody else paid for the domain name. Like, we had all these different things that we had to pay for. Candy to give out at parades and at the Halloween celebration and at Pride. And we needed water bottles with our name on it and our logo and stickers. And of course, you need everything, because if you're going to have even a campaign, even if we looked at this as a small campaign against book bans, we still needed all these materials in order to communicate with all of the people in our school district, in our part of the state, in our state, in the nation, to say this is what we do. Well, you can't raise money if you aren't officially a registered nonprofit with the government. It's awkward, but it's true. So what I ended up doing was last June, after we got through the whole meetings with the New Yorker, and I was getting phone calls for like a month and a half after this with editors double checking with me, making sure that the story was right. And then every single one of them said the same thing at the end of our conversation. They said, every time I talk to one of you down there, because there were about 5 of us that were talking to them, they said, every time we talk to somebody down there, we feel like we're talking to people in a different country. And I said, it is a culture shock. There's a big culture difference between here and New York, right? And they were in the city. Like, the guy I was talking to the most was in Long Island. And he was just like, how do I stop this from happening here? Because my Chinese grandparents, like, why is that important? Well, up there, there's still a lot of ethnic differences, like, really, truly. And he goes, yeah, I live in this community with, all of the Chinese people. And I was like, okay. I didn't assume he was Chinese, but apparently he is. He goes, and my parents and my grandparents, they want to take all these books off their shelf and they're scaring everybody. And how do I fight this? And I said, I got to be honest with you. I have no idea how I would do that if I was in Long Island. It's a different communication experience. It's a different community. It's a different set of values. But here's what I can tell you about how social movements work. And that's where that conversation had to go, because I couldn't tell him anything specific. I've never lived in Long Island. I've never lived in New York as a state, in fact. So, we had a long conversation about what kind of movement or that you could start. So anyway, in June, when all of that ended, I decided to go on and apply for 501c3 status, which, if you don't know what that is, you need about $250 to apply for it. And if you get it, which you will, normally, then the government will make you you don't have to pay taxes when you go to the store on items that are for that movement. You could give receipts for donations so that people can take a tax deduction at the end of the year. We could take a good amount of money over the course of the year. And as long as we do it all legally, where we're taking money in to the movement, then we can actually spend that money for the movement. If we do that right, then there's no problem. Needless to say, you have to be very careful with this sort of thing. It's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of work. God bless our treasurer. But what we needed to do was form an organization. We could no longer just be a social movement that's trying to fight against this. We now have to be an actual organization. So U-Turn Education became a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Now, does that make us part of the government? Does that make us institutionalized? I don't actually think so. I don't think that makes us institutionalized. And certainly the school district would not consider us institutionalized with them. I have been very, very lucky that the university has supported my work in this. My community members have been pretty supportive. And of course, I'm running for school board again, because what we do, besides just fight about book bans, that's not all we are. We create educational opportunities for people. For example, we hosted two college professors from Case Western Reserve and from Davidson College down in Georgia, I think it is. And we had these two professors who taught Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It's a graphic novel, and NYCSA was trying to ban it. A novel about the Holocaust because it had mice in it that were naked. And I was kind of like, this is ridiculous. So we fought them tooth and nail on banning that. And in the middle of that, these two professors zoomed in for 8 weeks and provided a free public course on Mouse. And the people who studied it learned how to read graphic novels. Suddenly we're enlightened about how this works as literature and why it's important, and also learned a lot about Art Spiegelman's intent with this book. Now, Spiegelman also called out NYCSA because we wanted to ban his book. That's not a good look. That's not a good look. So luckily, in their total wisdom, the school board decided not to restrict that book. We're talking about for high schoolers, by the way. We're not talking about little kids here. We're talking about high schoolers. So 13, 14, maybe 15, all the way up to 18 or 19, so full adults. So it was important for us to provide that opportunity. We've provided other educational opportunities. NYCSA One Read has a community book that we read over the summer. One of our members, board members, she runs a program over the summer called Book Bag, where they give out free books, book supply or school supplies, snacks, hygiene products, etc., to students who may not otherwise get those things during the summer when school's not in session. Really cool programs, but these are the kinds of things that our organization does. And what is it based off of? It's all based off the idea that we all deserve a good, free public education, even when we're adults, even to the community, not just within the school district and those who go to school, but also those of us who are using the public libraries, because of course they moved on from the school libraries to the public libraries. And the next thing I find myself doing is going to county commissioner meetings, which by the way are incredibly boring, going to those to make sure that they don't, I don't know how else to put this, screw over the library system. Literally, the Christian County Library has been under attack. The Springfield Library has been handling itself a lot better, but the school board up there is handling things a lot better too. And the freedom and debate over the moral ideas of education, because education is a value, and it is, in my opinion, a question of morality. If everybody doesn't have access to education, they're not going to have access to being successful when they're older. And so that's what it comes down for me. And so that is one example of a real life, very recent in the fact that it's still going on. I'm still running for school board, which, by the way, is a campaign. And it's within the larger movement of opening up educational opportunities. I hope that makes sense to you. So hopefully that real world example can help you understand how we define a social movement. And we're going to keep talking about how to do that, but we're also going to start talking about how to study these movements. For right now, let's just get it in our heads and wrap our brains around what a social movement is. Because that definition seems to be a little bit squirrely. All right, everybody, that is it for this week. I may be putting up an assignment for you tomorrow, which is Monday. And if you have any questions, of course, as always, let me know, and I'll talk to you soon.